Booyah, right on 7 o'clock on the 2nd. Good evening, everybody. Let's just see the obligatory Fs in the chat to make sure that the audio is working. Framing looks good. Oh, what's this shirt that I'm wearing? It must be the new line of merch. Yeah, I got the long sleeve version today because it's a little chilly out here. All right, well, we've gone live, and I have neither of the two other parties for the sidebar in the backstage. Now, I know they're coming. I hope they're coming. But even if they don't come, we are going to easily have what to discuss. If it's not international politics with George Szamuely, I will go on a rant and discuss the other stuff that's going on in the news, which is mind-blowing. And I know everybody's talking about the Chauvin trial and the recent revelations and Eric Nelson's motion or notice of motion for a new trial. What was I going to say? But that is not on the menu for tonight, unless we have some technical difficulties, and then we do it by default. The great thing about the subject matter that has become this channel, there's always something to talk about, and it's always fascinating, interesting, and dare I say, enlightening. Now, one question for everybody out there. Do I want to worry about the backdrop and build out or, tailor it to be something more professional, en guillemets, as we say in French, or do I like this now the way it is? 1 for leave it, 2 for build it. And let's see what everyone says. What else? If anybody who doesn't know who George Szamuely is, every time we have a sidebar with someone who I've known George. I was on the gaggle. I know him through Peter Lavelle. We know each other through the interwebs. But George Szamuely has got an amazing history, and not just of his life, his dad's life, his family's life in Eastern Europe. It's fascinating, and we're going to get into it. He's also got an interesting life of his own, being author of a book, Bomb for Peace, or Bombs for Peace, about Yugoslavia, NATO's intervention there. When I read about some of the history of Eastern Europe, I have the same problem that I have when I read about Bitcoin. I know I should understand the words that I'm reading, but I can't piece them together because I lack too much of the historical context to put these things together. I see Robert in the chat, which is great. I'm going to bring him in right now, and I see a bunch of ones, 111, 1.5, 1, 2, and a number of ones. Okay, good. Well, George Szamuely, we're going to start talking about George Szamuely in his absence. Oh, and I see he's tuning in right now. Okay, we've got everybody. Robert, how you doing?
Good.
Okay, and we got George. Let's bring him in and get this party started. George, what's up?
Oh, yeah. How are you? How are you, Viva? Hi, Robert.
So let me get the framing out here properly. That's the way we like it. Standard disclaimers. Be respectful in the chat. I did not put slow mode on because I think I'll be able to handle the chat. I may miss super chats. Don't be miffed if we do. What else? Whatever. This is gonna be a fun discussion. George, the last time we saw each other was in the heat of the presidential election.
That's right.
Non-disputes.
That's right. Yeah. You were on with the gaggle, and we were discussing the outcome of the election disputes. I kind of followed Barnes's position on that. I felt that Trump and his supporters had a very strong case, but if the courts refuse to hear it, then there's nothing much further we can do about it.
Yeah, and the audits are going. Well, one audit is going through in Arizona, but this is going to be a problem that's going to come out in the wash after many wash over a long period of time. But let's just do a standard intro, because I suspect there might be a few people here who don't know who you are, George. And before we delve into not just your life, your history, and not just that of your family, but like extended family, tell the world who you are, just in case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah, I'm George Szamuely. I'm an author, a journalist. I've written books. I am now here living in Budapest. I teach here, and I am a partner with Peter Lavelle, who is a host at RT. So we're partnered with this group that we formed, The Gaggle, and we are now on Locals. And I'm going to say it as Robert would say it, thegaggle.locals.com.
That's fantastic and phenomenal that everybody is breaking away from the financial and censorship shackles that come along with standard social media. George, I mean, let's go back. You're born in Hungary, but you have an amazing family history. Can you give us the overview of that? I know you have two Tibor Szamuelys in the family.
That's right.
One of whom has a untimely passing, I think, and the other one has amazing history.
Both were untimely. My great uncle was, as you said, Tibor Szamuely, who was one of the leaders of the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919. This is a bit of history that many people aren't really aware of, and people know about Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but they don't know that this was followed by a Bolshevik revolution of sorts in Hungary as well. And in 1919, the communists took power in Hungary. My great uncle was one of the leaders of this. He was the deputy commissar of war, and they held power for 3 months. Unfortunately, well, whichever way you look at it, fortunately, they were defeated in war, and they had negotiated an exile to leave Hungary, enjoying immunity from attack and from prosecution. However, my great uncle, who was associated with the terror that was part of that Soviet regime, failed to get that amnesty. So when all of the leaders of that Soviet Republic boarded the train to go to Austria, at the border, everyone else was allowed to go through except for my great uncle, who was arrested. And he committed suicide. He was only 29 years old. Subsequently, he acquired a kind of legendary status within the Communist International as, a great revolutionary leader who tragically lost his life. My family had been involved in one way or another in that Soviet Republic, and they were all arrested, imprisoned, and then there was an exchange of prisoners between the haughty government and the Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union, and so they were released from prison in 1921. They went to the Soviet Union, which is where my father was born, and he spent most of his life in the Soviet Union, again, as part of this communist aristocracy. He didn't return to Hungary until after the communists then came back to power in Hungary after World War II. This time, of course, they triumphed because they had the Red Army backing them. So he returned there, and then he was a professor there at the main university. And then I should say, one piece of information is that my grandfather, which is my father's father, was executed during the Great Purge, Stalin's Great Purge in 1937, because Stalin was just cleaning out pretty much all of the foreign communist parties. I mean, the purge extended not just within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but throughout all of the foreign communist parties that were living in the Soviet Union at the time. So, my grandfather was executed. However, following Stalin's death, he was among those who were rehabilitated. So it was a kind of peculiarity that many of the people who had been purged and executed by Stalin were rehabilitated by Khrushchev, with the exception of the right-wing deviationists, the sort of the Bukharinites. They were never rehabilitated until Gorbachev's time. But my grandfather, was, and indeed my family, was being part of the sort of the left-wing opposition, so they were rehabilitated, and that made life for my father relatively comfortable in Hungary during the 1950s. Nonetheless, he became disillusioned with every aspect of communism, and he took an opportunity to defect to the West. He was invited to teach in Ghana, where at the time was ruled by, I don't know whether you remember, Kwame Nkrumah, who was actually one of the earliest of the rulers of the post-colonial world. The Gold Coast was given independence in 1960, so he was one of the earliest of the post-colonial rulers. He was a key figure also in the Bandung movement, the non-aligned movement of the world, and he was, he played a kind of, both sides off against the middle, and so he was bringing in various academics from the communist world, and he invited my father to come and teach in Ghana. My father went there, and then after that went on a vacation to England, and that's when my father asked for asylum. And so I was only a child, and I was only 8 years old then, and so I grew up, went to school, university, and everything in England.
Now, so you were born
died, as I said, untimely. Sorry, just to show, my father was untimely. He died, really, it was in 1972, so he died when he was only 47 years old.
Now, so you were born in Budapest, spent time in Ghana, and then escaped to the UK. What was it like being a young kid in communist Hungary?
Well, I kind of liked it. I mean, I think it was quite enjoyable. The Kadar's government really was very mild, and although the leaders of the 1956 uprising were executed, I mean they were treated very harshly. Within a few years, Kadar began releasing everybody who was involved in 56, and it became actually quite a mild regime. All the Kadar expected from the people is no opposition. You can not like the government. You can, just give the finger to the government, but you do it behind closed doors. You don't make trouble. And if you don't make trouble, then we'll be quite lenient with you. We're not going to we're not be nasty, burdensome, and it became more and more tolerable. I mean, people were allowed to leave the country, not leave permanently, but to go on vacations to the West, as long as, they showed they were reliable, they'd come back and everything. So of the communist governments in the Soviet bloc, Hungary was actually one of the mildest, but, it followed the Soviet line very loyally. So, for instance, Hungary took part in the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in '68. Hungary was always part of that. There was no, there was no brooking, of any dissent there. So Hungary did not follow the path of Yugoslavia or Romania. It was a loyal trooper in the Soviet bloc.
Now, how long did you live in Ghana as a kid?
Oh, I didn't live. It was only just one academic year. It was just one academic year, and then my father took the opportunity to go on a vacation to England, and then he asked for asylum there and then. But again, Ghana was a little harder because I was just a little kid then, and this was really, wow. I never seen anything like this. You come from a country where you never see a black face, so then suddenly you're just you go to school and you're just this one white kid, surrounded by a complete sea of completely unfamiliar faces, and I have to say, I for one found this very hard to take. I was just very young, and got terribly homesick because I was sent to a boarding school, and so didn't have a particularly pleasant time.
George, you say you grew up in communist Hungary.
Well, I grew up. I left when I was 8 years old.
Close enough. I mean, you have memories of what it was like to be there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Your memories, of that at the time are one thing. I hear an echo. I'm just going to turn my volume down. Your memories at the time are one thing, and then your memories in retrospect are another. How do you look back on those memories now in comparison to the world in which we're living today? And I mean, what everyone says, we're going through communism in the Western world. All the COVID response measures are, communism infiltrating. I mean, what parallels do you see between the memories of your childhood and modern day life in America, Canada, and the US?
Well, it's very interesting because there's been a remarkable reversal of repression and tolerance between the West and Russia in particular. Less so in the case of the former members of the Soviet bloc. But if you look at, say, Russia's response to COVID, there's no vaccine mandate. You want the vaccine, you get the vaccine. You don't want the vaccine, you don't get the vaccine. No one, reprimands you. No one bullies you. No one terrorizes you. You want to wear a mask, you wear a mask. You don't want to wear a mask, you don't wear a mask. So it's an amazing kind of reversal from what used to be the case. I mean, and I think it's generally in the case of in Russia, is that it is a much more open to dissent than is the case in the West now. I mean, in the West, people just terrorize you. You don't have the right views, you get deplatformed, you get you get attacked, humiliated, excoriated. There's none of that in Russia. I mean, people try to pretend, with this, Navalny and everyone, somehow, we're back to the old days of Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, and the dissidents. Nothing of the sort. I mean, Navalny is someone who has no following whatsoever in Russia. I mean, it's a peculiar little subgroup of people who are his supporters. They have no following in Russia, and that's something very different from the era of the 60s and 70s, when the dissidents did have significant support. So the Western media want to pretend that, Russia is still the old days of the Soviet era. We are the avatars of democracy and freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Now, what was it about communism in particular that ultimately disillusioned your father? I mean, obviously, his own father getting executed and serving a little time in a labor camp might have disillusioned him, but aside from those factors.
Well, I think that was, but he also lived there in 1956. So, seeing the Soviet tanks coming in, it creates a little bit of a shock in his own mind, because, I mean, you're supposed to be this great advance of civilization. You're supposed to be the leaders of the working class, and the working class of Hungary has rejected you. I mean, it's very hard to just go on and make up stories, which, of course, the Soviets did. But, these are fascists, haughty-eyed, the Catholic Church, and all these, they're the reactionaries are trying to bring this about. But anyone who lived there in 56 would have known that this was a popular nationwide uprising. And so, it was rejected. It was a workers' revolution, a dictatorship of the proletariat that was rejected by the workers and the proletariat. And I think that really, formed a very strong impression upon him. So it was just, that he wanted no part of that. But I mean, obviously, the personal factor was surprisingly. If you're a diehard communist, even these personal issues weren't really that uppermost, because, his mother, my grandmother, she was willing to forgive the communists. Yeah, Stalin, terrible person, awful, horrible, good that he's been denounced, but, communism is still fine. And my grandmother, she never forgave my father for defecting. I mean, for years, they didn't speak. I mean, he went to England. They didn't speak. I mean, she regarded that as a profound betrayal on his part. I mean, after a while, there was some reconciliation, but it was she really held that against him. So a personal factor, then, that's her husband who was executed. And not only that, because, as you know, under Stalin, when, somebody is executed, the family is punished. I mean, it wasn't just, you go on living in your flat and everything's nice. I mean, you were exiled. I mean, and the family was exiled. So she and her 3 young children were sent off to Siberia in exile, because her husband had been a traitor. So, but even that, all of that, she was willing to forgive, or at least ascribe it all to Stalin. But she wouldn't forgive my father for defecting.
Now,
George,
what happened to your father's siblings? Did they stay?
Yep, that's right. They stayed. They stayed in Hungary. They also, it was quite a fraught relationship. Didn't really communicate. And in fact, they didn't come to visit us at all during the years that my father was alive. I mean, even though they could have come to visit. They didn't come and visit. I mean, no, it was. So they carried on living in Hungary. I mean, they weren't ardent communists or anything like that, but they also considered what my father had done as a betrayal.
Now, George, I mean, I'll state one thing up front so everybody who doesn't know, you're a journalist for RT, Russia Television. So people might think you're a Russia apologist or call it a propagandist for lack of a more accusatory term. So people are going to look at you and say, yeah, you're going to apologize for Putin, undermine the bad things that Russia's doing. I tend to view it a different way now. Looking at Navalny, from what I understand of the situation, I look at Navalny and Russia's and Putin's treatment of Navalny, and I see some arguably dissimilar but sufficiently similar parallels between the political prosecution that we see in North America, in the United States. And so my tendency is not to say what Putin's doing to Navalny is no big deal, but rather like who is the U.S. to lecture? So I say there's bad things on both sides here. And so not to undermine what's going on with Navalny, but the flip side, there may not be the draconian measures to COVID in Russia, but there certainly are draconian measures to other issues. People are mentioning in the chat, the Pussy Riot feminist group banned. I think they were arrested, but they got into some big troubles. No freedom of speech in Russia. A strong stance against homosexuality. So in some ways there's been a reversal. In other ways there's been no reversal, or at least maintaining certain strict ideologies on other issues. But I mean, what do you see in terms of parallels or distinctions between political corruption and political prosecution in Russia versus what we're seeing present day in America?
Well, I would have thought that the parallels are unflattering to the United States. I mean, let's just take as an example of what's been going on in regard to the events of January the 6th. I mean, we know that something like 400 cases pending against the people who took part. There are people who are still in prison, denied bail, the people who had taken part. There are people who are being held in solitary confinement, something that's deemed torture by the United Nations for having taken part. And this is what? There was no violence there at all, save for the
shooting of Ashley Babbitt,
the killing of Ashley Babbitt, or at least the violence. I mean, the scuffles with the police. We still don't know very much about exactly what happened, because I mean, from what we can tell, the police underreacted initially, overreacted subsequently, and that some of the violence that took place between the protesters and the police may have been as a result of the police overreaction. Nobody's really looking into that. But nonetheless, I mean, these are very harsh measures being taken against people who, you can say, loitering, trespassing, disorderly conduct. These are not really kinds of matters that justify such peremptory, punitive measures that the government is taking. Now, the contrast with Navalny is that he was convicted in a court of law for corruption. I mean, that was like a corruption. He was sentenced to a prison term, but was granted probation. It's quite humane, granted probation. He then violated the terms of his probation. Well, what happens in the West if you violate your terms of probation? Well, your probation is canceled. And that's what happened in his case. So
the flip side with that is, when you violate your probation, we've seen it with Assange. We've seen it with Tommy Robinson. I think it's unjustified and borderline cruel and unusual. In the same way, I think with Navalny, it might have been, I don't know, what weight do you put on the fact that the European Commission said that the trial was fundamentally unjust, corrupt? And what do you say to anybody else who's looking at this and saying, yeah, a conviction in the Russian system is about as good as the guy in North Korea. It had beer in his name.
Kim Jong-il?
No, the American who was convicted and sent home.
Warmbier.
Warmbier.
I've forgotten his name.
I think it's Warm. Otto Warmbier.
Warmbier. Yeah.
I mean, what do you say when a conviction? Some people are going to say a conviction in Russia, that's as good as an Otto Warmbier conviction in North Korea, and you have the European Union or the European Commission of Human Rights saying it was an unfair trial to begin with. So you have the different plays here. What do you say to people who say, like, I don't place much weight on that conviction any more than I placed the weight on the prosecution of the Jan 6 rioters?
Well, I think that trial was reasonable. I mean, I think that it is the case with Navalny. I mean, I think Navalny was a kind of a rather somewhat shady character. He was involved in some shady financial practices. This kind of things that he was accused of is the sort of things that people are regularly sent to prison for in the West. Now, I mean, the problem is that the West is having real difficulties getting on its high horse and making these denunciations of Russia when we have the horrific example of Julian Assange. Now you say, the same thing with the probation with Assange. Yeah, but Assange did his time on that. He was given the maximum time for jumping bail, and he served his time. Yet he wasn't released, and he continues to be imprisoned in a supermax prison with the worst human beings imaginable. I mean, his fellow prisoners are child rapists, serial killers, and really the worst of a terrorist. I mean, these are the people. So even on the very basis of like the justification for keeping him in prison, even when he served out his term, and even when a judge had actually denied the extradition request of the United States, you'd have thought that here at the minimum you would release him. I mean, he's won his point, which is his extradition is denied. Yet nonetheless, he continues to be kept there in the supermax prison, while apparently for years, because these appeals could go on forever. I mean, the United States is appealing this, so he has to be kept in prison here, and he's not even being moved. You would have thought at least they would move him to a minimum security prison, which would be justifiable in the case of somebody who has been convicted of no violent crime. So it's very difficult then for the West to start, getting on its high horse, particularly when the other day Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab and Secretary of State Tony Blinken were talking about how, we represent values and that this is an alliance of values. And unlike Russia, they have no values. Well, what are your values? What values are these? When you're persecuting the most famous journalist in the world, the most famous political prisoner in the world, and when the U.S. government wants to get its hands on this person who's committed no crimes, who has only basically just has exposed the war crimes of the Western governments. They want to get its hands on him and send him away for 175 years. What kind of values are these? And of course, as Robert would point out, what about these trials that take place on a regular basis in the United States? I mean, Roger Stone, he's sent to prison. Then it turns out that the foreperson was lied on her voir dire, misled the court about her own political proclivities, and then the judge said, "Nah, so what? He'd have been convicted anyway." I mean, those are the values. And then, of course, we're going to have the Chauvin thing. I don't actually believe that this case is going to be that the judge will nullify the verdict because we found out that this person had lied to get onto the jury. I mean, he'll still say, "Nah, well, it doesn't matter. He'd have found him guilty anyway, and everyone else found him guilty. So what the hell?"
What's fascinating to me is the West's definition of cases like Navalny, of cases like Bill Browder, remind me of the Soviet Union and the Cuban era of defining certain terrorist cases in the United States as really being political prisoner cases. And yeah, I mean, Navalny's just a fraudster. He's always been a fraudster. He's been a fraudster for a long time. He's as popular as Lyndon LaRouche was in the United States. In fact, LaRouche probably had more meritorious claims, and he stole less money. And LaRouche stole less money than Navalny has. But what's amazing is that the Western ability to script a narrative around these events, because what's interesting to me is when it's domestic politics, we have an ability around the world to resist the institutional narrative because we have our own lived experience that can contradict it. But when it involves a foreign nation, we're completely susceptible to whatever the media propaganda and institutional propaganda is. We have almost no independent lived experience to contradict it. Almost no independent sources that we have trust or confidence in that have any degree of platform. And consequently, we get an incredibly distorted view. I mean, I know when I first visited Russia in 2000 and I think it was 2004, 2005, I was stunned because I had all this impressions of Putin and Russia based on what I'd heard in the West and in the States. I go over there and find a completely different perspective by the actual working class, ordinary, everyday Russian. I mean, things like there is freedom of speech in Russia. I mean, they protect it as much as we do these days, unfortunately, more than maybe they do in Canada and Scotland. I haven't heard of any, pug memers getting put in prison in Russia. But the West does a very good job of caricaturing it. And because we have a lived experience and few independent sources to trust, most Americans have delusional views about it. That's what was so shocking about Trump. I mean, the first thing that stood out to Trump when I was looking at him was when he was saying we should have a different relationship with Russia and Putin. Putin had a 2% approval rating at that point in the United States. Now it's still low, but it's like up to he basically Trump by himself raised it to 12 or 15% as people did their own independent investigation and came to their own separate conclusions. But before we sort of jump back into that, what was it like going? So you're born in communist Hungary. Your parent, there's a brief, Ghana, and then you're in the United Kingdom and in England. What was that like? That transition like?
Well, when you were a child, you kind of do as your parents tell you to do. I mean, you're living in Hungary 1 minute, the next minute you're living in Ghana, and then the next minute you're living in the United Kingdom. I mean, you just say, okay, well, my parents know what they're doing, so I better do as they tell me to do. So I didn't really think that much about it. I mean, I was just, I did what I was expected to do. Go to school, learn English and do well in school, go to university, and so on. Subsequently, I think you kind of realize that these kinds of transitions are quite, they take their toll. I mean, there's a certain, well, maybe trauma is too strong a word, but there's a big cultural shock that you have to kind of adapt to and make peace with, and then and that kind of shapes your life subsequently. So in a way you find it really, yes, you're living here now in the United Kingdom, you're a British citizen and so on, but you never really feel British. I mean, you know what Britain's like. I mean, Britain has a very distinctive culture, and it's even many people in Britain find it difficult to belong to a distinctively British culture, and I did find that quite hard to adapt to that. But as time goes by, of course, you live there and you get used to it, and Hungary is now already quite a long way away from, because hadn't lived there now for many years. So, and of course, because of politics and because essentially we had politically defected, there was really no question of ever even going back to visit. I mean, that was out of the question until after the communists had left. So I'd say that it wasn't an easy transition to England, which is probably why I eventually ended up moving to the United States, where I lived for many years in New York, and did a lot of journalism, teaching in New York. I mean, I think probably the reason that I felt was a little uncomfortable in the UK.
What was the London School of Economics like?
Oh, that was that was a lot of fun. It's very funny because people assume that the London School of Economics was this hotbed of leftism, and because briefly in 1968 there was a kind of a kind of a famous professor there, kind of a Ralph Miliband, and many of the people who were in 1968, a lot of the protests, they took their inspiration from Miliband, and then of course his sons then became prominent within the Labour Party. They became leaders of the Labour Party, David Miliband and his brother. But in fact, the London School of Economics was actually a hotbed of conservatism. I mean, the most famous professors there were Michael Oakeshott. He dominated the Department of Government. He was a famous conservative political philosopher, and he staffed that department government with a lot of famous conservative writers and thinkers: Elie Kaduri, Ken Minogue, Bill and Shirley Letwin, and then of course there was the Department of Philosophy and Science that was dominated by Karl Popper, who, although not a conservative, was again, no leftist by any stretch of the imagination. So the other was a kind of odd. It had the reputation, throughout the world. Oh yeah, all the left is there. But when I was there, it was a real hotbed of not just conservatism, but a kind of incipient Thatcherism. I think it was just about the time that Thatcher came to power in the UK, and this was almost like a kind of a think tank of Thatcherism. So the people there were all ardent Thatcherites. The Letwins, Minogue, Kaduri, they loved Thatcher, and they were all zealous in Thatcherite advocacy.
George,
and what led to New York?
Well, I kind of really was fascinated by American politics, and I really was interested in getting to know more about America. It was just intrigued. I mean, just somehow, I don't know, I kind of got a little restless in the UK, so I thought I'd spend a little bit of time in the United States, and then I really enjoyed that. I mean, New York was a lot of fun, and there was just a lot more of opportunities for doing journalism, or the kind of journalism that I was interested in, kind of political journalism, in the United States than there was in the UK. I mean, the UK really, you just had had a couple of political weeklies in those days, a couple of political weeklies, the Spectator, the New Statesman, and then that's about it. And then other than that, you just did all the, and of course, Encounter, that famous magazine from the CIA days, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But then when you went to America, I mean, it was a welter of these all sorts of these magazines that had come about, which was really quite fascinating. There was Public Interest, there was Commentary, Partisan Review, the New Criterion. I mean, there was the American Spectator. I mean, it was just it was a real welter of kind of intellectual magazines.
George, I got to ask you the tough questions. Like when Dershowitz came on, and if I didn't ask him the question about Epstein Island, my audience would have killed me. I got to ask you the hard question. What's the deal with the library books that led to your arrest in 1999?
Well, what happened was that, I was living close by to the New York University library. I used to go there and make use of the books, and I thought, well, how can I borrow books here? And then somebody told me, well, what you can do is you can register for a course. And so I said, okay, well, isn't that kind of expensive, registering for a course? Yeah, that's true. But you see, you could join the School of Continuing Education, and then you could do a course that comprises just, one visit to an East Village wine store, and you say wine tasting in the East Village. That'll only cost you about $30 a semester. if you pay $30 for a semester, you get to use the library in an unrestricted fashion. So okay, well, I'll do that. You know, I signed up for a course, and then so every semester I would come along and I would sign up for some course, and I would have unrestricted use of the library. It was very nice. I mean, no one else had thought of it. I mean, and but eventually, you know, I kind of started accumulating more and more and more of these books. You know, it was kind of, I didn't even notice. It was just kind of grow. And then at some point, the NYU just sort of said no. You know, they cracked down on me, and said, you know, return all these books. And I somehow thought, well, I didn't really have any. I had so many books at my disposal. I really didn't have any means of just getting them all to the back to the library. And with each passing day, every single book was accumulating a fine. I mean, so you know, whatever, it was 570 books, and it was like 25 cents a day per book. And I thought, okay, well, let things sort of drift on and hope that maybe I'll work something out with NYU. They could send a truck, collect all the books. And then nothing really happened. I didn't hear anything from NYU. And so until one fine day, I was arrested as the opening sentence of Kafka's The Trial. And so they kind of charged me with grand larceny, which was always kind of silly because I never intended to sell the books or really make any money on that. I mean, I kept the books in pristine condition. They got all the books back and everything. But that was really quite impressive because there was 2 felony counts that they charged me with, both of which I think carried prison terms. So did
you pay a $31,000 fine, or was that just what they charged you?
That's what they claimed, which is ridiculous because they got all the books back. So no, but I did have to pay I mean, we had to work out what's the word? What is it you work out with a prosecutor?
An arrangement, a plea deal or a settlement.
Yeah, that's it, a plea deal. That's right. So it was a plea deal. They charged me with a felony. I pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, and I had to pay a big fine. It wasn't 31,000, but it was a hefty fine and 2 community service.
My
what
goodness.
was the community service?
200 hours of community service. That was hard because you have to find some place where they're actually going to hire you to do community service, and that they think that you're even remotely competent to do it. So I went to a hospital, you know, I'll do a community service, you know, visiting patients, but I did such a terrible job of it. I somehow antagonized the patients and the nurses and everything, so they kicked me out. And then again, you know, I went to a kind of it was actually in a bookstore, which would have been okay, but it was run as a charity. But they thought that I somehow, you know, they gave me the most boring job imaginable, which is you had to put all the books in appropriate alphabetical order. And, you know, I don't know, sometimes I guess I made a mistake, you know, put one book here instead of somewhere there. Anyway, they kicked me out of there as well. So it was actually quite hard, you know, getting those 200 hours accumulated because, you know, every 2-3 months I had to go back to court and they would ask me, well, have you completed the 200 hours? Well, I've got about 220. What's happening? Well, you know, there's a problem. Well, you better complete it by next time you're here. So
I had to do not community service, but rather I failed a class in high school, moral and religious education. And so I had to go volunteer. And it's tough to log those hours because they count the hours. And I did it also at a hospital where I killed all the goldfish in one of the fish tanks because I tried to clean up the fish tank. Almost as bad as your experience. I'm just going to read this. Ceiling Fan says, the gaggle with Peter and George is great. Thanks, Mr. Barnes, for the introductions. And Mike Bruno says, disagree with most things Viva and Barnes say. V&B always entertaining, need the distraction, and this is good. Well done, Viva and Barnes, for that. Thank you very much, Mike Bruno. Which This is actually probably a good segue into the gaggle. Peter Lavelle, how did you come to know him, and how did you develop that relationship?
Well, I used to appear quite a lot on Crosstalk, as you did, Robert, the other day, with a very good performance. So I used to appear quite a lot, and then I didn't really have that many personal dealings with him while I was living in New York. But when I came to Hungary, I started to talk to him on a regular basis, and then we would chat, once a day, once every few days, and then we came to the thought that, well, hey, why don't we just see if we can monetize our conversations? See, we could record it and then see one of them, and it was pretty good for a while, until, of course, YouTube suddenly decided to demonetize us. And as is YouTube's wont, they don't exactly tell you what it is that you've done that merits demonetization. I mean, we appealed it, but we haven't heard back from them. So now we're on thegaggle.locals.com, and this seems a lot more promising. I mean, I know there isn't the censorship, and there isn't all of the threats of demonetization and deplatforming as there is on YouTube. So it was just really a matter of let's see what we can do with our regular conversations. I mean, people will find it interesting or not, and it's turned out rather well. I mean, although we're still on YouTube, haven't been kicked off YouTube, but we get a nice audience, and people consistently say that they find it interesting and entertaining. So that part is nice. The monetization would have been even better, but it's good that at least we have an audience.
I want to get into sort of being an independent public intellectual that dissents from the established opinion, which in many different respects, father and grandfather actually were in their own respects.
Right.
And maybe there's a common tendency of library books. If anybody's watching from the University of, from the Chattanooga Public Library, and they find a lot of books that may be still overdue, it's not me, it's my evil twin, Paul. He's the one who took them out as a young boy and didn't return them. You had to find, I called it alternative unstate-sanctioned redistribution of wealth. That was my opinion.
Right.
There might be some few candy bars when I was a kid that fit the same category, but that's another story. But in the sense of it being able to establish an independent, dissident public opinion, which has become, even in my view, arguably more and more oppressive, almost Soviet-like in the way the West has created a monopoly through its corruption of the academy, its corruption of the press, its corruption of the think tanks, its corruption of government bureaucracy. Can you, if you had wanted to be an establishment guy or a deep state person, one of these guys that formed that new thing that they're doing, the kind of, your Elliot Abrams of the world, people who commit real crimes and get away with it. Can you explain to people how easy it would be? Like the practical grifter thing to do is to join that line of opinion. It's not to be a dissident. If you become a dissident, you don't get employed, you don't get jobs, you don't get academic gigs, you don't get nice press coverage, you don't get columns in the New York Times. Could you describe some of that experience in experiencing being a public intellectual on the dissident side?
No, that's exactly right. It is extremely difficult if in any way you buck the trend and you don't follow the party line. So when you say Elliot Abrams, so if you're a part of that neocon establishment that started coming to the fore in the 1970s and is still powerful, you are doing very nicely. You're going to be, you go from think tank to administration, back to think tank, and then the think tanks are just they're interchangeable. They're whatever they're called, Heritage Foundation, Hudson Institute for Ethics and Public Policy Center, AEI. I mean, they're just interchangeable. People just move from one to the other, and it's like the sort of Indian restaurants. They're all basically just one kitchen preparing the meals for all of them. So that's the way it is, and if you do that, if you say all the right things, Soviet Union, then Russia, absolute evil, worst thing imaginable. Iran, determined to destroy Israel off the face of the earth. Iraq must, Saddam Hussein must be destroyed. You seem to say all of those things. You will do well. You will be showered with lots of money. You will get the nice affiliations. You will get published in the reputable newspapers and magazines, and your life will be comfortable. You will never go short. And it's very interesting that there are people who came from the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia who kind of figured out how America works, and they made a lot of money by becoming essentially like professional Russophobes. Like people like Julia Yoffe, who's again a ubiquitous presence in the Atlantic, with GQ, New York Times. She gets on all the TV shows and everything. Now, why does she do that? Well, she tells the Western audience what they want to hear. And now, it was one thing when you had an earlier generation of people who say, well, I hate Russia because of the communists, what the Bolsheviks did, terrible, what they did to my family and to my property, and I absolutely hate it. And people say, oh, yeah, well, of course you hate them. But this new generation, they hate Russia because they just hate Russia. And why do they hate Russia? Because that's how you get rewarded in the United States. So when Julia Yoffe or Max Boot, and many people like that, they come up with all this stuff about how Putin is planning to take over the world. They have a ready audience, and lo and behold, they're columnists in the Washington Post. They're on MSNBC and CNN. So you do get rewarded if you provide the perspective that people want to hear. If you don't, then you're going to find life quite cold, lonely, and miserable.
But now, actually, George, interesting thing, like flip side of that, RT, Russia television. Everyone out here says it's Putin's mouthpiece. I have been called an agent of disinformation for having been on crosstalk with Peter Lavelle. I don't care. I mean, I don't care about the accusations. I don't care about the accusations of having you, who writes for RT or is a journalist for RT, on my channel. I can have discussions with people I disagree with without a problem. But what is the expectation at RT? Is it a similar type expectation as writing for the New York Times, but just flipped over, or do you have journalistic freedom for RT?
Well, I mean, what RT does is provide a platform for people who have difficulties getting a platform in the West. I mean, they don't expect you to say what they want you to say, but if you have somehow a point of view, a dissident point of view, something that doesn't get a hearing in the mainstream media, RT provides you with a platform. Now, if you say to somebody, whether it's me or Max Blumenthal or you or anyone else who writes for RT, would you rather be writing in the New York Review of Books? Would you rather be in the New York Times, on the Washington Post, than on RT? You probably say, yeah, I'd much rather be there. I don't get that choice. The New York Review of Books isn't knocking down my door saying, oh, please write something for us. So RT is really just a platform for people who don't get the kind of perspective, the position that they should get according to their talent. I mean, look what's happening now. I mean, you've got somebody like the late Stephen Cohen. I mean, this is a man who's one of the most distinguished intellectuals, experts on Russia. I mean, he's been an academic dealing with the Soviet Union and Russia for decades. And lo and behold, he suddenly he can't get on CNN. He can't get on in any of the major networks. So where does he end up? He ends up on RT. I'm sure he'd much rather go back to the way he used to be when he was, led the Russia coverage on CBS. But that option was closed off for him. He was suddenly demonized. He was suddenly Putin's puppet and excoriated, as a hack and so on. So I think people say that, oh, you get on RT, you're because you're want to spread propaganda for Putin. No, people on RT because they can't get on any other platform in the West.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is RT has been much more aggressive, even covering Putin. Like they extensive coverage of Navalny, despite serious questions about the true authenticity of a lot of those protests.
Right.
Then institutional West press has been over what happened on January 6th. Or even we see an example of it with the George Floyd trial, the death of George Floyd in the Chauvin case. I mean, there are many news stations that even though it comes out this juror person basically lied to get on the jury, deliberately, clearly intended, in my view, to drive. I mean, he answered about how he, it was like a real runaway jury from the book and the movie. I mean,
it's crazy. It's crazy because it was so implausible in Runaway Jury, but we're there in reality just a notch down. Sorry, Robert, I had to.
Yeah, that's precisely right. So much so that NBC refused to even talk about it. ABC had a lawyer on who was like, oh, just because he had a shirt about get your knee off our necks, that doesn't mean he's biased. And I was like, that'd be like listening to a 1950s Birmingham news reporter saying, just because that juror was seen in a Klan outfit doesn't mean he has any bias against a black defendant. I mean, it's that level of incredulousness. But the other thing I wanted to get into was the sort of corrupting institution of the sort of the think tank personnel that's led to the sort of deep state apparatus. And that we have in particular with the sort of junior varsity Obama team that's now the varsity team for Biden administration, and how much they're influenced by two great influences as far as I can tell, Kissinger and the Clinton administration. And they have an almost delusional view of foreign policy, but one that is reflected and representative of that experience with those kind of mentors. You wrote extensively about one of the first great debacles of this set of policies in Yugoslavia, about the well-titled book "Bombs for Peace," NATO's humanitarian war against Yugoslavia. Could you describe? And that was the first color revolution. Was of course brainstormed and employed to great effect in Yugoslavia, or then later Serbia. Could you describe some of the history of that and how it previews the mindset of the current Biden administration?
Yeah, no, it's very important that the Democrats are as, if not more, committed to interventionism, aggressive war, imperialism, whatever, by the United States as the Republicans. But they want to dress it up in nice, soothing, humanitarian, democratic terms. And the Yugoslav crisis came about almost at the same time as the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and the Soviet Union itself seemed to be on its last legs. And so there was a lot of panic around. And so, well, what are we going to do now? I mean, are we going to have to shut up shop with NATO? And so the whole, Clinton people, the entire NATO apparat seized on Yugoslavia to find a new cause for NATO. So they had to, well, what's going on? No, we must keep NATO going. And what's NATO's mission? Humanitarian intervention. And so when they jumped into Yugoslavia and decided that the evil party here was Serbia. Well, there was a reason why they picked on Serbia. First of all, Serbia was, it's clearly always been regarded as Russia's little brother. It shares the same, Eastern Orthodox religion. The language is quite close, and Russia, after all, gone to war in World War I on behalf of Serbia. So this was one reason why they demonized Serbia. Another reason was that, well, it was led by Slobodan Milosevic. Now, Milosevic had been a communist. I mean, his career was, he had been part of the communists. He chose not to go down the path of NATO and the West, but he wasn't a nationalist. And he was, in fact, opposed by the Serb nationalists. I mean, the Serb nationalists like Draskovic, Djindjic, Vojislav Šešelj, They didn't like Milosevic, but Milosevic actually adhered to the much more of the internationalist, communist ideals. So when Yugoslavia began to disintegrate, encouraged by the West, initially by Germany, and then Germany then decided that they're going to recognize the seceding states, whether anyone liked it or not, even though the UN Secretary General Perez de Cuellar said, don't recognize because you're just creating problems down the road. Germans said, we don't care, we're just going to recognize them. Well, we knew what the next step was. Once Croatia and Slovenia were recognized as independent, then Bosnia was going to go for independence. And what was going to be the consequence is that the Serbs, who were the most populous nation in Yugoslavia, were going to find themselves outside of Serbia proper, living in countries ruled over by governments that, in the case of Tudjman, were apologists for the Ustasha regime of World War II, or Izetbegovic in Bosnia, a Muslim leader who had actually been imprisoned in World War II, or immediately after World War II, for being essentially a collaborationist, a fascist collaborationist, and an Islamist. He'd been always an active Islamist. So the Serbs were obviously very unhappy with what the West had done. I mean, the West had actually supported the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and which the Serbs were lost out in a massive way. And therefore, the West decided, well, we'll blame the Serbs for everything, for the breakup of Yugoslavia, and for the fact that they weren't very happy with the setup in which there were suddenly minorities in all of these republics, where once they had a common state. And that was it. That provided the rationale for the NATO intervention, demonizing the Serbs, whose one crime was they didn't accept the way the West broke up Yugoslavia, because what they did was, there'd been no negotiations on the terms of the breakup. There'd been the Constitution had been violated, and the administrative boundaries that had been drawn up in an arbitrary fashion by the communist government were determined to be, these are now the international frontiers, even though they didn't bear any kind of rational relationship to the national composition of where people were living. So the Serbs protested, and the Serbs decided to do what the others had done, which was to try to create facts on the ground and then, try to renegotiate. And this then provided the sort of the Clintonian move that, we need some new goal for the United States, humanitarian intervention, and it was determined to be against the Serbs. But one other thing was, of course, that all of this was based in itself on a complete hypocrisy, because, the way Yugoslavia broke up, and they said, okay, each of these republics would be the international frontiers of each of these republics would be those that were drawn up by the communists. So this is the Serbian Republic, a Croatian Republic, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, no changes to the borders, with the exception of Serbia. And in the case of Serbia, the Kosovo was taken away from them. So that was the one republic. Then they decided, well, forget what we said about these administrative boundaries would be the international borders. We're just going to take Kosovo away from you. But that provided the template for all of the subsequent intervention. Remember, this was in 1999. It was just 2-3 years later that the United States then immediately began planning for the invasion of Iraq, because they felt that we had done so well, it was so easy to defeat Serbia. Iraq should be a pushover. And the same cast of characters was there. Tony Blair, who was a key figure in the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia. Clinton, who's such a shady character, you couldn't really have him posing as the great humanitarian. So he kind of hid behind Tony Blair. So Blair was the one who was traveling around the world, proclaiming the West's commitment to humanitarianism. And then he came to Chicago, I think April 99, delivered a huge speech about that this is our goal, our mission, values that we're going on for a crusade. So yeah, and then Blair was then on hand to do something similar for George W. Bush a couple of years later.
Well,
George.
and that relates to one of the questions from our chatters. Sort of two components. One is for people who want to look it up. I gave Clinton credit in the sense that he repeated "Wag the Dog." If you go back and watch the film "Wag the Dog," they go to war in Albania, which part was right. Kosovo's right next door, and they do it for the refugees, which he managed to repeat. It was almost like a wink and a nod to everybody as to who he was and what he was doing. But the second component is it's almost like a hush-hush episode, is what actually happened to Milosevic. There has been some, ultimately there's the color revolution, which we'll get to a little bit later, but he ends up being tried in the International War Crimes Tribunal that in the West, the United States, we still actually reject their authority. It's kind of ironic. Israel rejects their authority, but somehow their authority is perfect for the purposes of Milosevic. But putting that aside, right as his defense is coming to its conclusion, as it appears he's having much more success as the true facts come out inside that proceeding, at least within the court of public opinion, if not the Hague itself, suddenly he ends up dead. And as one of our eternal truths is, Epstein didn't kill himself, there's a good question that maybe Milosevic didn't kill himself. Could you describe some of the evidence that concerns that?
Well, that's in fact, that's a very, very interesting case. Now Milosevic had gone there, he wasn't in the best of health. He had a heart condition, but he conducted, as you said, his defense very effectively. But then, his condition started deteriorating. So, he called for, for his doctors to come and give him a diagnosis. So they gave him a diagnosis, and they recommended that he go to a clinic in Russia where they could address his heart condition, whatever it was that they needed to do, put some stents in or whatever. Milosevic's assigned attorney, was assigned by the court, made the duly to this motion to have him sent to this hospital in Russia, and the court, of course, rejected it and said, "Oh well, we perfectly good medical facilities here in The Hague." But they haven't really done anything about it. I mean, they haven't actually, addressed his health concerns in all this time. So it's a little strange for them to suddenly come up with, we got these perfectly good health facilities in The Hague. Well, you haven't done anything to facilitate. But then, and this is when we get very strange. I mean, as his health deteriorated, they did some blood work on him. And then they said, "Oh, we found some rifampicin in his blood." Now, rifampicin is an anti-leprosy medication, and it's very, very strange that they find anti-leprosy medication in his blood. So he wrote a letter to the Russian Foreign Ministry, essentially saying, "I think they're trying to kill me. How the hell do I get this anti-leprosy medication, rifampicin, in my blood?" And then lo and behold, a few days later, he's dead, heart attack. So when the ICTY really had a problem on his hands, because on the one hand, only about 2 weeks earlier, they had denied him the opportunity to address his heart condition, and then he dies of a heart attack. And then they've got the whole rifampicin thing on their hands. So they turn around and say, well, he would have probably died anyway of the heart attack. And as for the rifampicin, he must have administered it himself, in order to, maybe induce some kind of a heart condition so that he could then go off to Russia. But the problem was that, what's the evidence for this? I mean, they made the accusation that Milosevic administered the rifampicin himself. Well, how did he do it? Where could he have got this rifampicin from? I mean, it's not like he frequents the dispensary in the prison. And they said, "Oh well, one of his aides must have brought it with him in an envelope or something." Well, the ICTY monitored all of his meetings with his aides. So if any one of them had passed the rifampicin to him, then they surely would have a record of this. Again, they didn't come up with it, but they came. They had to accuse him because otherwise, he's the one who actually had written to the Russian, foreign ministry saying, there's rifampicin in me. Where the hell, what's going on here? So it's, oh yeah, he did it himself. And it's typical of the ICTY that he just throws around these accusations without anything to back them up. The autopsy after his death didn't record any evidence of rifampicin. So you'd have to say it was a very, very strange death. There wasn't any kind of a proper investigation because the ICTY is a law unto itself. It doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of anybody. I mean, it was supposedly answerable to the UN Security Council, but the UN Security Council just never really bothered to do any oversight. So it's not answerable to the Dutch government. It wasn't answerable to the European Court of Human Rights or any court at all. So they could just investigate themselves and say, no, we gave him the best medical attention imaginable. He killed himself. I mean, that was it. He just basically administered the rifampicin himself. And the mindless media just, that's just the kind of nasty thing Milosevic would do. He would just administer this dangerous medication himself in the hope of getting to a Russian hospital. I mean, they're ludicrous. I mean, why would anyone start administering dangerous medication and thinking that you're going to come out of this in any livable state? So, but that's what the typical of the ICTY.
Well, George, what about what happened with Slobodan Plaljak, who himself consumed poison like in the court?
Well, well, there were some of them. Yeah, that's true. That there were some of them were indeed suicidal. But Milosevic wasn't one of them. I mean, I think there's no evidence, and no one who knew him thought of him as suicidal. I mean, I think he really felt, and you could see during the trial, that he saw what he was doing as, fighting for the soul, the pride of the Serbian nation. I think he thought that he was trying to restore the reputation of the Serbian people. I mean, he saw this as his mission. So there was no question in his mind that, well, I have to commit suicide. I mean, he knew that he'd be found guilty. I mean, that wasn't really an issue. I mean, he knew. I mean, as soon as they arrested him and took him to The Hague, that of course they would. I mean, that's the way the ICTY operates. I mean, they find people guilty. I mean, that applies to the Serbs exclusively. I mean, if you just look at the way the ICTY operates, it's something like 80% of the years that the ICTY has handed down to the defendant, 80% were handed to Serbs. You remember, this was a four-sided war in which atrocities were committed by all sides, and yet 80% of the years that were handed down by the ICTY were handed down against Serbs. And only 3% of the years handed down were for crimes committed against Serbs. So that tells you what the ICTY is about. So Milosevic knew that, yes, of course, he'd be found guilty, genocide, whatever. So he saw this was his opportunity just to essentially rehabilitate the reputation of the Serbian nation.
Yeah, and if people had been following the trial, even the people that disliked Milosevic were frustrated because the trial was much more for Milosevic in terms of the court of public opinion than anyone had anticipated, because the caricature of him was never true. No. Now, the other aspects to which Yugoslavia predicted the future, aside from color revolutions, was the nasty habit of the West aligning with some groups that ancestrally had serious problems, and many of them still had some beliefs associated and attached with that.
Yes.
And we see it now in Ukraine, and we saw it in parts of Georgia, seen it in parts of the Middle East, seen it partially in Afghanistan. But in the sense that, one, we decided, people forget with it, that the sides that were anti-Serb in that conflict within Yugoslavia sided with the Nazis. disproportionately. I mean, yet the Serbs were accused of being Nazi-like, but
That's it.
we were and that for the Serbs that was a real memory, just like it is still for people in Eastern Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And it's something that's never discussed in the
Right.
American Western press.
Yeah.
And the second group we decided to get involved. Well, really, there's three, but the second big group was we decided, well, let's arm some jihadists and let's help train them, like we were doing in Bosnia. This too was completely suppressed from the Western coverage. And then, last but not least, was people forget Albania was the main conduit of sex slaves trade in the world. I mean, we were involved with some ugly organized crime, and this will probably be my second cinematic reference. People watch The Whistleblower, and I think Rachel Weisz was the main actress, and see what was going on there, including UN-connected people. In terms of our facilitation of that activity, promotion of that activity. It has its own Epstein-type tie, you might say. But can you discuss the U.S. getting in bed, consists in the West, getting in bed with some of the nastiest actors and how that almost always leads to trouble down the road?
Yeah, no question. I mean, you summarized it excellently. Because you remember, this is 1991. So therefore, only 45 years had elapsed since World War II. Therefore, the atrocities of World War II were a living memory for many, many people. And even if, to younger people, it wasn't a living memory, their parents had a living memory. So they knew about Jasenovac, this death camp that was run by the Ustasha. The Ustasha, because the Ustasha was just more than just a collaborationist state. This was an active Nazi ally, a vicious, Nazi regime that also, incidentally, occupied much of Bosnia, again in alliance with the Bosnian Muslim. So the Serbs, the first thing that happened, I mean, you had these elections in Yugoslavia, first free election that you have. Into power comes Tudjman in Croatia. And what is the first thing that they do? First thing is they change the constitution to remove the Serbs as a constituent nation of Croatia. I mean, it's a very important thing that every single constitution of Croatia up until then had said that the Croatian Republic is comprised of the Croatian and Serbian people and minorities. So it was always that they were a constituent, constitutive nation of Croatia. Boom! They changed the constitution. So, oh no, Croatia is just simply the nation state of the Croatian people. The Serbs now just became a minority. So, given Tudjman, given his whole background of being an apologist for the Ustashas. I mean, yes, it's true he had been a partisan when he was 20, but ever since then, he had been a Croatian nationalist. He had actually been imprisoned after the 1970 so-called Croatian Spring, when suddenly, again, Croatian nationalism started springing up before Tito cracked down on it. But, Tudjman was involved in all of that. So, it was not surprising. The Serbs really did not want to go down this path of becoming a minority within an independent Croatia. But the West was thoroughly supporting Croatian nationalism. And they knew all this about Tudjman, but they kept it quiet. And instead they said, "Oh no, it's the Serbs who are nationalists," even though if you look at the constitution, the Serbian constitution, Milosevic's constitution, it was nothing like that. It had any sort of saying that, oh, it was this is Serbia is just the nation state of the Serbian people, and nothing that was never said anything of that form, because Milosevic had been a part of the communist system. Tudjman wasn't, and it was the same thing went with Izetbegovic in Bosnia. As I said, he had been imprisoned after the war for his activities in war. He had been imprisoned subsequently under Tito for his Islamic activities. And then again, he had been in 1980s, he'd written all these tracts about Islam and how Islam and the non-Islam cannot live together. I mean, he was a very, very active Islamist. So these are the people that the West aligned itself with. but then denounced the others for being further nationalists, which is, and as I said, it's just so completely untrue in the case of Milosevic. He was hated by the Serbian nationalists. I mean, he imprisoned the Serbian nationalists. He was, people like Šešelj, spent time in prison. I mean, because Milosevic didn't want to have anything to do with them. So you're absolutely right. It's just like what happened with the coup in Ukraine. First thing they try to push the Russian language out. I mean, it's already, this ludicrous notion, this Ukraine, independent Ukraine, in which Russian is not even an official language, even though it's the language that everybody speaks. 70% of the Ukrainians, speak Russian all the time. Yet nonetheless, only Ukrainian is an official language of Ukraine. But even that wasn't enough. The people who came to power in 2014, wanted to push Russian out altogether. And it was this that provoked the reaction from in the Donbass, where these are people who are essentially Russian nationals. But again, this is minimized in the Western coverage. Instead, they say, "Oh no, it was all Russian aggression, Russian invasion," and without anything. But what are the grievances? Why would these people be so upset about these coup leaders in Kiev, given that the first thing they do is to attack the Russian language? So the same way, why would you think that the Serbs are so upset about allowing Croatia just to go off on its own, where Serbs were a substantial minority, given their historic memories, and given that the first thing these people did as soon as they won an election, the first free election after the fall of communism, the first thing is to push the Serbs out from the constitution.
George,
well,
I'll just read
there's twofold that are sort of impactful, the template of Yugoslavia as to what it forecast for the next 20 years, and for a lot of the people in the Biden administration think that was a great heroic achievement. Absolutely. What they did in Yugoslavia. One was they unleashed this idea of ethno-nationalism, that you could just carve out part of a country, have a referendum, declare yourself a new country. That secession became approved and mandated. Well, so then when in Crimea, they say, well, you set the precedent. You said if we don't like the situation, we can hold a referendum and do what we want to do. All of a sudden, the West eliminates that whole history in the media coverage. People are like, oh, Russia invaded Crimea and the rest. Crimeans were, they're overwhelmingly Russian. Nobody has any doubt they wanted to join Russia, and definitely didn't have any interest. I mean, historically, have not really been long part of Russia. That was part of the USSR and Khrushchev's thing. But putting that historical aside, same thing in Georgia. I mean, in Georgia, all of a sudden, we have two independent republics that have really no long historical ties to being part of Georgia. The moment that Georgia tries to really invade those places where there are Russian peacekeepers, all of a sudden, secession's not okay, and all of a sudden it can't be recognized. But that was all unleashed in Yugoslavia. The West set that precedent. And now all of a sudden we want to pretend that precedent can't be set. And then the other part we did is the whole, and like I would say, if we did a literacy test on international European policy between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Europe, 95% of Americans would fail because there's basic stuff they don't know. And one of the biggest ones is that we lied about everything related to NATO. That our whole pitch to the USSR was, hey, you just get rid of the Warsaw Pact. You allow your whole republics to dissolve and create their own independence. We'll unleash ethno-nationalism as an extra kickback. But don't worry, we'll never expand NATO. After all, NATO has no justification after the USSR is gone. It was formed to respond to the Warsaw Pact. But instead, we have been violating that now for decades. We broke that promise very quickly. We continue to. We're really the aggressors, not Russia. We continue to try to remove all the buffers between them and Western Europe and the U.S. And could you describe how much that impacts sort of people like Putin's mindset as to how they filter these things, and how the Western media's refusal to cover it leads people to have a very distorted view of what's really happened?
No, you're absolutely right. And Yugoslavia was really the turning point for Russia, because up until then, the Russians had idealistic delusions about the West. But when the West just marched in and arbitrarily said, okay, we're just going to recognize all of these independent republics. When look, there is no basis in international law to recognize unilateral secession. You're not supposed to do that. I mean, because it has to be, and the terms of a secession have to be negotiated. But then the West just did it. They saw this as that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to break up Yugoslavia and break up the Soviet Union, and they rushed in. They didn't bother with anything, any negotiation, anything, and then they cobbled together some nonsensical thing. I don't know whether you remember the Badinter Commission. The whole point of the Badinter Commission was that Robert Badinter, head of the French Supreme Court, is to rubber stamp what Germany was going to do anyway. Germany said, we're going to recognize Croatia, Slovenia, we don't care what you do. And Badinter came up with a nonsensical thing. So it's not to say, well, we're recognizing unilateral secession, because that would be embarrassing. So say, well, Yugoslavia is a state in dissolution. So it's not really secession, it's a state in dissolution. We're just recognizing that it's dissolving. And then the West could say, oh, well, we did our best. We're not doing any, we're not recognizing secession. But you're absolutely right. So if Yugoslavia could not exist, it's a state in dissolution. They can't live together. They will hate each other. We've got to let them all go. Well, then why did the West insist on keeping Bosnia together? I mean, Bosnia is even a completely arbitrary state. I mean, there's no such thing as any kind of Bosnian people. There was the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. I mean, it was a made up entity, and there was no reason whatsoever to keep it together. But the West saw this as effective tool, largely to repress the Serbs. I mean, so yet another state in which the Serbs would be a minority. But in any case, what really irked the Russians was Kosovo, because this was such an unprovoked aggression. It was so flagrantly in violation of the UN Security Council resolution, because the Russians thought, well, we'd actually gone the extra mile in working together with the West on Kosovo at the Security Council. And then the Clinton administration said they just decided to ignore the resolution. They were going to bomb anyway. And the Russians then realized that there's nothing they could do about it. Back in 1914, they'd actually gone to war with Austria-Hungary on behalf of Serbia. This time, they couldn't do anything. They just sort of sat there, mouth agape, and realized, wow, we are really weak. Not only are we hopelessly weak, the West just despises us. I mean, they don't even bother to consider how we feel about anything. They just went ahead and bombed our little brother and said, we don't care what you think.
George or Robert, someone's got to answer this, because I suspect a lot of people, this crowd might know. Most people might not. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949, 30 European, North American countries to protect from. What's the context?
Well, it wasn't 30 at the time, but yeah, it was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yeah, sorry.
Because we only know NATO now, and Trump talking about everybody paying their fair share. But what was the essence of the creation of NATO? What was its purpose, and how did it evolve over time? I don't know which of the two of you are going to be best to answer this.
Well, that's right. I mean, you're right. I mean, but that's very interesting, because it was the original term that was coined by Lord Ismay, who was the first Secretary General of NATO, was to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down. And that was the rationale. That was Lord Ismay's famous saying. And so the idea was that, we're defending the West against Russian aggression, and we're hoping that the Americans are going to stay. They're not going to go back as they withdrew from after World War I. But it's very important to remember, 1940, NATO came first. The Warsaw Pact did not come into existence until 1955, so 6 years later, and it only did so at the point at which it was basically German rearmament, because that was at that point the Russians really started taking NATO seriously, because they were always worried about a rearmed, resurgent Germany. But it is important that even during the Cold War, the initiatives were always taken by the West. I mean, the West starts NATO. The Warsaw Pact comes subsequently. Same with nuclear weapons. I mean, obviously, America was the first to use nuclear weapons, but every single innovation in nuclear weaponry was always the Americans, and then the Russians were caught up. So in a way, it wasn't that surprising that when the Warsaw Pact dissolves, NATO said, "No, we'll still be around. We'll try to find a mission." You'd have to say Gorbachev was staggeringly naive in his dealings with the West. There's no excuse for somebody of his stature, somebody who had worked his way up through the apparat, to believe that any of the West's pledges, though, we will not move 1 inch to the east following the dissolution of the Warsaw. Not 1 inch. No, there'll be no NATO membership for any of the former members of the Warsaw Pact. No. We're not going to move our forces into the east of Germany. No. Take our word for it. I mean, how can any serious person believe any such pledges?
Well, I think that reflects most Americans are unaware of how many broken promises America and the West has made to the rest of the world.
Right.
I mean, Putin made this point that the reason why we have, to some degree, the problem we have in North Korea's nuclear armament is that we said, "Hey, Gaddafi, you get rid of weapons, we won't do anything," and then we invade. Saddam Hussein, we remove his ability to make weapons, and then we pretend he has them and then invade anyway.
Right.
And we've done this repeatedly and routinely again and again and again. But the great broken promise of what we did on NATO to Russia is why Russia is so defensive and protective. And of course, people forget Russia has historical narrative. I mean, Putin grew up this way with his parents, tells the story repeatedly. I mean, if you visit St. Petersburg, you understand how what they call the Great War is indelibly impacted even on new generations, because they just have fields there of buried bodies, fields after fields after fields after fields. And so for them, they remember they've been invaded multiple times from Europe and didn't want a hostile army right on their borders. And that's what we've been trying to do for 20 years. That's why I'm sure Trump shocked the heck out of the national security state when he said, maybe we don't need NATO anymore. Just using instinctual logic, just saying, why are we obsessed with Germany rearming? That doesn't make sense. Why are we obsessed with a Soviet Union that doesn't really exist? Why don't we get along with Putin? Because we don't have real disagreements with Russia. Our disagreements are elsewhere. Why don't we align where we can in terms of differences of opinion with China, and particularly radical jihadi Islamic policies and politics is a great danger to Russia and the United States. But and that's where he was unfortunately sort of boondoggled out of those policies by the Russiagate mythical narrative. But in taking it back to Europe, the other great European experiment during this time period, of course, was the European Union, to sort of create this neoliberal world order, the kind of things that people like Milosevic were against, and that's why he had to be taken out. But one of the people was your sister helped form the foundation of UKIP and the beginning of Brexit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, that's right. But that's an interesting case. Yeah, she was always very ardently opposed to the European Union. And again, I think it's interesting of the perspective of the immigrant. I mean, the immigrant comes to the UK and becomes fiercely anti any idea that the UK loses its identity, loses whatever it is that made it unique, and then it would be somehow smothered in the kind of the EU pot. So she was from a very earliest age very opposed to the European Union, and then she was indeed one of the founders of UKIP with Nigel Farage, and I have to say I never thought that this would come about. Because I remember the 1975 referendum, and it was just so overwhelming. It was 2-1. The British voted in favor of the European, but it wasn't called the European Union then. It was the EEC, and there were very strong opponents of the EEC in those days. There was Enoch Powell on the right. You had Tony Benn on the left. You had much of the Labour Party on the left was very opposed to the EEC. And of course, you had the political establishment was for it. But the British people voted. They voted 2-1 in favor of remaining in the EEC. And I thought that was it. I mean, that's an issue that's settled. That it won't come about. And I think it would have continued that way had it not been for what Merkel did in 2015. I think Merkel is more responsible than anyone else for the British moving out, because by essentially opening the door, the floodgates to immigrants, she really caused a huge anxiety among the British. I mean, the British have had a long-standing problem, a very serious problem with immigration. I mean, it was Enoch Powell famously made his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. So that it's been a big issue in Britain about mass immigration. And when Merkel just opened the door, the British just thought, this is it. This is what the Europe is going to be about. They're just going to be keeping open the doors. And of course, what Merkel was doing was not just letting everybody enter Germany, but then everyone has to be parceled out. So the British get some, the French get some, Hungary gets some, everyone. So I think that was the one, that was the decisive step that led to the British voting against Brexit. I think had it not been for that, I think there would probably Britain would have stayed in. But this was a serious business.
George, what was the ultimate outcome of that? I mean, some of us don't remember because we've been inundated with the COVID crisis, but 5 years ago, it was the migrant crisis in Europe. Merkel opened the floodgates, let millions into Germany. Am I not mistaken that at the end of the day, the German government actually was paying some of the migrants to return home?
Well, I think what they've done is they're keeping these migrants in Turkey. So there's about 4 million migrants in Turkey that Erdogan is continually threatening to unleash. And what Merkel does is he pays a tribute to Erdogan. Keep that border closed, keep the migrants in Turkey, and then every time Erdogan wants something, and the Europeans seem reluctant to give him what he wants, he suddenly threatens, well, maybe I think I'll open the floodgates and see how you like that, and then Merkel writes out a check, and that's that. But basically, she ended the policy by bribing Turkey, to keep them away from Europe.
Well, the other thing is this was all unleashed thanks to the destabilization of Iraq, then the destabilization of Libya, then the destabilization of Syria, which unleashed these migrants in the first place, gave Turkey the power to use it as leverage against Europe, and then ultimately, of course, backfired against them with the Brexit vote. But did that experience give you faith in the capacity of ordinary people to resist a powerful institution and an institutional narrative, and that something that looked impossible became real with Brexit and your own family's involvement with it?
Well, I think so. I mean, that was a victory. They won. It was it happened. No one could have believed it, and that's a great thing. On the other hand, in the United States, I mean, it happened almost at the same time. Trump's victory, which was always it's also a kind of a popular revolt. Something, the elites were caught, flat-footed, didn't know what to do. There, the elites have managed to make a comeback. They organize themselves and working now very assiduously to
fortified the election.
Exactly, to crush Trumpism. So, it's hard to know whether you have faith. I mean, I'll ask you, Robert. Do you believe that the populist revolt will prevail again in the United States?
Yes, I think so, because I think it's similar to partially how Brexit came about. The underlying problems they haven't fixed, and they're panicking at a level. You don't have to go to the great lengths that they're going in the January 6th proceedings, talking about unleashing domestic surveillance, trying to stack the Senate with DC statehood, trying to pack the U.S. Supreme Court with their committees. You don't talking about treating 75 million Americans as if they're worse than ISIS terrorists. You don't have to go through all of those shenanigans if you're coming from a place of confidence. It's because, I mean, that's the interesting thing of what you and your family has witnessed over time is how quickly governments can crumble, how quickly revolts can take place, how quickly public opinion can shift, and how quickly things that seem like they would never change overnight. Yes. And I think ultimately the core issues that are driving people, I mean, I think one of the reasons the neoliberal and the neoconservatives both hate Putin is he believes in borders. He is more of a nationalist than an imperialist, believes heavily, the great defender of the Orthodox Christian faith, has no interest in wokeism of any kind, and all of those things, and has no interest in the neoliberal or neoconservative order, and it drives him insane. I mean, Russia was supposed to be particularly for the Clintons, but the whole West was supposed to take it apart. Like what they did in Yugoslavia, they're supposed to repeat in Russia. The labor and the land and the resources were supposed to be devoured by the West, and they were supposed to resurf the rest of Russia. And they just, it backfired because they were too aggressive. People don't like Putin. Well, just understand the West birthed Putin more than anyone else. Yeah. In that sense, I don't believe in a lot of the myths that most people have of him, but I'm a dissident in that respect because there's almost nobody who voices that opinion in the States. Now, in that capacity, so you go from the UK to New York, and then you end up going back to Budapest. What led you to go back to Budapest?
Well, I think that I was kind of really interested in Orban. I mean, I was interested again. I mean, he was Hungary, small country, seemed to be punching above its weight. Orban suddenly became this very important, influential figure. And that really did fascinate me. I wanted to witness this, to see what this is all about. Not only, did he really agitate, and he still does. He agitates all the leaders of Europe who would love to be able to kick him out of the European Union. But he also had an enormous influence in the United States. I mean, Trump took his cues from Orban. I mean, Orban was first. I mean, it was Orban who first raised the whole issue that, no one comes into this country. We're not an immigrant country. We don't want anyone here. And we certainly do not want Muslims in this country, because, we have an unfortunate history of.
And that's what people often forget. Eastern and Central Europe can remember the various invasions, the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of these components that in the West because we're both a young country and have a lot of historical amnesia about the whole rest of the world, don't understand this context that other people immediately see the threat for what it is. That if this isn't controlled, if this isn't limited, that unlimited immigration can look a lot like an invasion, like the kind that their ancestors experienced repeatedly over and over again, and it tended to not look so pretty.
No, that's exactly right. People just don't realize that. They just Orban, he's just bigoted and whatever. Yeah, but Hungary lived under Turkish rule for 200 years. I mean, the Turks just broke up the country. I mean, it was a huge undertaking for them to be liberated from Turkish rule. They really do not want to go back to that. And you're absolutely right. And that's something also an important issue in Yugoslavia and in Bosnia. They associated the Muslims in Bosnia with the Turks. I mean, these are the people who converted to Islam in order to be the ruling class in Bosnia. They were the Turks rulers. So yes, history is a sort of omnipresent in these countries, and of course in Eastern Europe. I mean, these are small countries. They are small countries that have very distinctive cultures, languages, traditions. They can easily be overwhelmed. I mean, for when Merkel says, "Oh yeah, come on over," I mean, in a country in Hungary, which doesn't even have a population of 10 million. Even a few thousand immigrants will have a huge impact. So that was a very big deal. But Orban, I think, blazed the trail there. It was really interesting. And interestingly, Trump himself retained an admiration for Orban right through to the end. I mean, even in 2020, the height of the election, he telephoned Orban while Orban was at home preparing dinner in his kitchen, just in order to have a chat with him. Orban was, I think, the one world leader who unequivocally came out for Trump during the election. So now, he's definitely a persona non grata with the Biden people.
I found Budapest fascinating. I didn't even realize there was two different cities until I visited. I didn't realize there was Buda and Pest. I think there was a third one they originally combined, but now Budapest. There was also a great absinthe bar. I don't know if it's still there. They made like 26 different absinthe cocktails. I lost both of my credit cards there. Got stuck in Budapest for a little while after that. But one of my other favorite museums, one of the most impressive museums I've ever been, is the Museum of Torture that's there in Budapest. Right, I mean, because it goes through what the Nazis did, what the Soviet KGB did, just all the way history. Then it has that at the end, it has the photos of people that are still alive and where they're at. I was like, wow, they were engaged in the torture. Have you ever been there? And is it
I have, yeah. It's quite a creepy sort of place because it's done in the form of a dungeon. I mean, it's like you're slipping in and out as if it's like a dungeon, and you say, right, this is going to be your prison cell. You're pretty much just there, stuck between two walls. That's very effective. But there's no question. I mean, a nation like Hungary, pretty much its self-identity comes from the idea that it liberates itself from conquerors. There was the Turkish conquerors, the Austrian conquerors, the Russian conquerors, and now the EU conquerors. So Orban has this skill. I mean, he taps into the Hungarian national psyche. He said, who's the new oppressor? Who's the new master in town? And Hungarians, they respond to him. So the EU, but been trying desperately to somehow rein him in. Or ideally to kick him out. They can't really kick him out because there has to be a universal vote, and there's this familiar Hungarian-Polish alliance because if they kick Hungary out, they might kick Poland out next. So Hungary and Poland are always united together against the EU. So Hungary and Poland differ, particularly in attitudes towards Putin. I mean, the Poles just absolutely loathe Putin. They loathe the Russians. Hungary doesn't have any of that. I mean, Orban has very good relations with Russia and with Putin. But so on that, they disagree. But on EU intervention, they're absolutely in alignment.
George, let me read this question here. Mihovil P, and he's had a few other good questions, which I brought up, but I can't read through. Can George answer why were stations like Yugoslavia, Iraq, and many others even made? Who is the architect behind artificial multinational states?
Well, that is a very good question. I mean, the problem that they found, particularly in Yugoslavia, is that once the empires broke up, Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone, Russian Empire is gone, German Empire is gone, Ottoman Empire is gone. You suddenly have all of these, small national groups. And although Woodrow Wilson had talked about national self-determination, they didn't quite know what to do with it, and so they decided, well, we'll create these various entities that they seem to be fulfill aspirations for national self-determination, but we're not just going to have a whole bunch of tiny little statelets. So that's why they put together the state of the Yugoslavia. So it's the Yugoslav. It's the state of the Southern Slavs, and they cobble them together. Not very successfully initially. Subsequently it was a little bit more successful under Tito, but initially it wasn't terribly successful. But it was a way of somehow a compromise between national self-determination. Having sort of proper entities. Well, with the case of Iraq, I mean, those were just those are just colonial boundaries. I mean, they were just cobbled together by the colonial rulers and the local rulers. And so they just assigned territories, fiefdoms to their favored local rulers. I mean, those are completely arbitrary and shoveled together people who really had nothing very much in common with one another.
Now, from sort of a life history perspective, the common question I ask, but I'm always curious about what leads people to be sort of independent free thinkers, to follow their own path, pursuing their own understanding. I mean, you've had a long family history of that, father, grandfather, sister, others. What do you think it was in your life experience or in your learning or that led you to be independent of mind and follow whatever you thought was right, regardless of what was either in an economic self-interest or the institutional narrative?
Well, I think it's you grow up and feeling that people are unfortunately have what passes for conventional opinion is based on very ill-informed opinion. It's based too much on accepting what is the accepted narrative, and then you feel this from an early age that, well, if this is the accepted narrative, there's something wrong with it. So even like, all right, you're living in the UK, everybody's against the Soviet Union, and since we had defected, we're against the Soviet Union. But even then, but it's based on kind of silly ideas about the Soviet Union. I mean, it's based on ignorance, and so you kind of feel all the time that whatever is the conventional view, that is just simply, a lot of it is just people are just repeat the same thing. Somebody says something and everyone repeats it, and then it becomes an echo chamber in which everybody else accepts the conventional view, and you never really feel that that's adequate. So it then becomes a habit. You feel that, well, okay, everyone says that Orban is a terrible person, and so, well, okay, so that means I know that's wrong. Now let me see, why this is wrong. What exactly is going on here? But that's a different mentality, and I don't think it's necessarily what one should do, because I think one should live well. One should be prosperous. I mean, I think you, Robert, I think has done a much better job of it. I mean, in other words, I mean, you also buck the trend. You don't follow convention, but you've managed to make a prosperous career out of it. You followed your destiny, and you've managed to make a good living at it. And I think, but many kind of public intellectuals, who are of independent mind, I mean, I think they have they have difficulties just trying to make a living. I mean, that it becomes a big job.
George, I hear some pitter patter upstairs that might come down sooner than later. So one broad question: Biden has now won the election. I mean, I know the discussions we had going back a few months and the way things were transitioning. Biden is now in power. We see who he's putting in positions of power under his administration. What do you see as being the future now for, call it Russian-American relations and America's role in potential or the next upcoming conflict? How do you see that going down now?
Well, as with everything else with Biden, I mean, he says one thing out of one corner of his mouth and says something else in the other. So he's talking about holding this summit with Putin without having actually explained what the purpose of the summit is. What are they going to discuss? What's on the agenda? And while at the same time he's imposing sanctions on Russia and calling Putin a killer. The Russians don't know what the hell he's doing, what the hell any of this is about. But this is the way Biden operates. I mean, it's just, it's like same with the JCPOA with Iran. Oh yeah, we're going back to the JCPOA, but Iran has to do this, and this before we get back in. So, my own feeling is that nothing whatever is going to come of this summit. I mean, maybe it'll take place, but I doubt whether there'll be anything more to it than the United States will issue its familiar litany of complaints, and the Russians will respond. When we know the kind of things the Russians will say: "You destroyed states. Your regime change operations have been utterly destructive of human life, resources. You promised that there'd be no NATO expansion. And look what happened." So it'll just simply be an exchange of abuse and lead to nowhere. Now maybe Biden or Blinken will then say, look, we stretched out our hand in friendship and Russia spurned it. But the point is that they haven't really thought any of this through. I mean, I think that, it sounds like a cool idea. Hey, let's have a summit with Putin. But, but without any kind of agenda, without any purpose in mind. So I actually think that things will deteriorate in U.S.-Russia relations.
And what's your thoughts on? I mean, I think the risk of conflict is definitely up. If there was over/under odds, I'd say within a year somewhere we're going to have some sort of hot spot explode. And whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's Venezuela or Bolivia, someplace somewhere. Just because this deep state apparatus under the Kissinger mindset that action is its own value. I mean, that kind of insanity. Sort of imperial epistemology of a kind. And that this Biden administration seems particularly infected by a lot of this sort of Clintonian mindset, still not realizing it's no longer a unipolar world, that's gone. They don't really recognize that. Thus they get smacked around at that summit in Anchorage with China. And then, of course, you've got all this Biden corruption involving Ukraine, involving China. You have the Democratic Party's corruption involved in it. They're trying to suppress by going after Giuliani and other people.
Yes.
What do you think the probability is that to me, I've described it as we have the worst set of Western leaders, particularly in the U.S., since what brought about World War I. We have people that combine arrogance and incompetence. Yep. I didn't like Kissinger, but at least his IQ, I didn't distrust his IQ. I distrusted his moral compass. But these people are they're like Kissinger's much lower IQ brother. And so what do you think the risk is that something blows up somewhere in a crazy way during the Biden administration?
I think the risks are very high. I mean, I think that we came quite close, I think, to a conflict in Ukraine just a little while ago. I mean, that they were sending these warships into the Black Sea. And then cooler heads prevailed, and they suddenly decided that, it's not such a great idea. But, now Blinken's off to Kiev. Why is he going to Kiev? I mean, it's like, there's nowhere else that he needs to go. So he goes to Kiev. All of this is taken as encouragement for the Kiev authorities to, mount an offensive. Now, Russia has now absolutely drawn a red line in Ukraine. I mean, they couldn't be clearer. So Kiev mounts an offensive, we intervene. I mean, they're not joking around. So something like that could easily spiral out of control. I think Syria could spiral out of control. It's still, the Americans are still determined to affect a regime change. They absolutely loathe Assad. They still somehow they've got the fixed in their minds. They have to do something against Assad. So that could again explode into a very unpleasant confrontation. I think, and then there's also all the activities that they're engaging in the South China Seas. Also, very dangerous stuff there. Anything, again, the Chinese have drawn a red line on Taiwan. So U.S. gets involved there. Again, very dangerous. The Baltics. I mean, the Baltic states, they're led by people just pathological. in their hatred of the Russians. They're also NATO member states. So that's even worse than Ukraine. Again, something there could easily spiral out of control, and then suddenly we get a U.S.-Russia confrontation. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. People like Blinken are sort of utterly incompetent. You can just see that he's clueless. I mean, as soon as he opens his mouth, the man's completely incapable of articulating any American national interest that he seeks to realize. I mean, and this is very different from, say, Nixon, Kissinger, or Carter, Brzezinski. I mean, Brzezinski was a total fanatic, but they were very smart. But Blinken opens his mouth and he starts about foreign policy, and he starts about climate change, or values, or democracy. So, what is it? What does it do for America? I mean, how are you helping the American people by this sort of nonsense? So you really get a sense that these people are dangerously clueless, and this could easily just wander into some conflict.
All right. What do we say here? Let me just bring up one thing about Bill C-10, censorship in Canada. Canada potentially going the path that's not the path that we want to be treading on. But George, what time is it where you are now? You're 6 hours ahead.
Yes, it is now 3 a.m. But I should say that I am a night owl, so it's not such a not such a tragedy.
If we go any longer, you're going to be the morning owl. But no, 2 hours we wind it down so that I can convert this into the podcast more easily. But George, I'm going to be digesting a lot of this historical information, which I've been putting in the memory bank, and now it's going to run through the printer as I sleep tonight. Thank you tremendously for coming on, and we do this let's do this periodically and get the international discussion going, because Robert and I, we talk US and to some extent Canada, but bring in the international aspect. This is an amazing discussion to have.
Well, it was great fun. I enjoyed it enormously, and of course I'm a huge fan of your Sunday night show. I never miss it. I always learn a great deal of legal information. In fact, I replay it several times because some of the legal minutiae that the two of you engage in, it goes over my head a little bit. So I have to listen to it several times over.
This Sunday is going to be a big one because there's been developments in some big issues that we're going to be talking about Sunday. So, George, thank you very much. Stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the audience, hope you enjoyed. It was just too much information. I'm going to have to rewatch. But
if for anybody I offended, which I'm sure there's many groups around the world that I offended with my views and opinions, you can only effectively troll me at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. And if you want to get more independent information from public intellectuals outside of the institutional narrative, then go to the Gaggle, local.locals.com.
And George, where else can people find you if they want to? You're on Twitter under your real name, your full name.
You can find me on Twitter, and you can also look at us on the Gaggle, on the YouTube. And then, for anything that I write on RT, you could just simply, put in RT op-eds, I think whatever that, I'm not sure what that website is, but RT op-eds, George Szamuely, and then, you could find my work there. And, of course,
and your book.
Buy my book.
Ordinarily, I read or listen to the books before the streams, but I couldn't get yours on Audible, and the only version I saw was $133 on Amazon. So, and plus, I can't read paper anyhow; I fall asleep. But if and when one day it's on Audible, I'm going to get it.
I'll just show it so people can see it. Here it is. Bombs for Peace.
That looks like a big book.
War in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, it's a great book, great template, but my favorite part of it is the title, because it's a very apropos title.
So, Robert, George, stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the audience, thank you very much. We'll see you no later than Sunday, possibly earlier. So have a good night.